The morning Naomi Ward walked into Amos Kell's trading post with a bundle of pelts strapped to her mule. The snow had not yet let go of the high passes, and the town of Coldwater was moving slow and stiff in the last cold of a mountain spring. But the moment those furs hit the counter, every last soul in that post went still as a held breath. It was the spring of 1878, and Coldwater sat wedged in a fold of the northern mountains where the river came down hard and green out of the peaks. It was a rough place, timber and stone built up around the fur trade and the cattle that grazed the lower meadows, and the people who lived there had the particular hardness in their eyes that came from watching the mountains take more than they gave. There was a doctor who was drunk half the time, a livery, a saloon that smelled of pipe smoke and regret, a church where a thin reverend preached guilt on Sundays, and Amos Kell's trading post, which was the beating heart of the whole town. If you needed flour, you went to Kell. If you needed traps or powder or a good knife, Kell had them. If you needed to know what was moving 3 valleys over, Kell knew that too. Amos Kell was 36 years old, broad through the shoulders, with long dark hair going early to silver at the temples and a thick dark beard over a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. He wore wool and worn hide like the trappers he traded with, because he had been one once, up in the high country, before his knees and his patience for the cold ran out, and he came down to build something that stayed put. He had built the post from a one-room shack 9 years back, alone, hauling timber and sleeping on the dirt floor of an unfinished building, because the land was his, and the work was his, and he had never once in his life expected anything to come easy. The women of Coldwater had tried to match him with their daughters and their cousins and their friends passing through, and Amos had been polite about every one of them while feeling nothing at all, which he had come to believe was simply the shape of his life. Then Naomi Ward walked through his door. She was 28, which he would learn later, though she carried herself like someone who had lived considerably more years than that. She was not small. She stood straight and sure, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed felt hat that had seen hard weather, and a coat of good hide over a faded blue dress and boots worn honest at the heel. She had a face that was striking rather than pretty. High cheekbones and dark green eyes and a mouth set in a line that said she had learned to keep her words until she was certain they were worth the trouble. Behind her, through the open door, Amos could see her mule standing patient in the cold, loaded with something wrapped in burlap and rope. There were 4 others in the post that morning. Old Tobias Fenn was picking through the tobacco tins. Hetty Vaughan was comparing bolts of cloth and missing nothing. Her boy Warren loitered near the candy with the studied nonchalance of a child pretending not to want. And Deputy Boyd Crane leaned against the far wall, eating a biscuit and taking up space in the large, lazy way that Boyd Crane always took up space. Every one of them looked up when Naomi came in. She walked to the counter, set her hat on it, and said, "I was told you deal in furs." "I do," Amos said, "depending on what you've got." She went back out to the mule without a word, and Amos watched through the window as she untied the load with no wasted motion. And then she was back inside with a bundle that took both arms, and she laid it on the counter with a sound like a settled argument. She untied the rope and folded back the burlap, and what lay beneath it stopped Amos cold. 11 beaver pelts, cured and stretched with extraordinary care, each a rich dark brown with the density that spoke of cold water animals taken at exactly the right season. 4 otter beside them, sleek and flawless, not a bad cut on any of them. And underneath, rolled separate, a mountain lion skin, tawny gold and supple and clean, uniform from nose to tail without a single blemish from poor work. Amos had been buying and selling fur since he was 17. He knew good work when he saw it, and he knew extraordinary work when it was staring him in the face. These were extraordinary. The tanning alone was a skill most men he dealt with never truly mastered. The lion skin, in particular, was worth more than most cowhands earned in 2 months on the trail. The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of a shop. It was the silence of a whole room recalibrating. Old Tobias had forgotten his tobacco. Hetty had set down the cloth. Boyd Crane had stopped chewing. Even the boy had drifted closer without meaning to. Naomi Ward stood with her hands folded and looked at Amos steadily. And in that look was every woman who had ever walked into a room and been weighed and found wanting before she opened her mouth. She was waiting to see what he would do with what he saw. Amos turned the nearest beaver pelt over, checked the backing, pressed his thumb into the fur. He lifted the edge of an otter skin and studied the tanning. He crouched to look at the lion skin from an angle, checking the stretch. Then he straightened and looked at her. "Who did the tanning on these?" "I did," she said. "All of them." More silence. But this was a different silence than the first. The first had been about the Pelts. This one was about her. Amos leaned his forearms on the counter. "Where are you coming from?" "North, 40 miles up the Coldwater, a place called Elkhorn Bend. I have a homestead claim there. That's high, hard country." "Yes," she said, as though hardness were a fact and not a problem. "You trapped those waters alone?" "My husband trapped with me until last fall." She said it in the same even tone she might have used to say the winter had been long. "He passed in November. Fever." Amos looked at her a moment. "I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you." She did not look away, did not invite sympathy, did not offer sentiment as currency. She was there to do business, and her eyes said so. Amos did the arithmetic in his head, careful and honest, the way he did everything. The beaver would fetch strong prices from the Denver buyer who came through twice a year. The otter would go fast. The lion skin was the kind of piece a well-moneyed man in Denver or back east would pay dearly for. He told her what he could offer per pelt at fair market rates, and then he told her separately what he believed the lion could command. She listened without blinking. "If you get what you say for the lion," she said, "I'll bring you 6 more beaver and 2 more otter by the end of June." Amos almost smiled. "That's a business proposition, Mrs. Ward, Naomi Ward." Amos Kell. She put her hand across the counter and he shook it, and her grip was firm and dry and certain of itself. Behind them, Boyd Crane had gone back to his biscuit, but his eyes had not left Naomi Ward since she walked in. Amos noticed that, and something in him noticed it with a pointedness he filed away without examining. The transaction took another 20 minutes. Amos counted the money out careful, stated every number aloud, showed her his price sheet without being asked. She reviewed it with the focused attention of a person who understood figures and trusted no one's accounting before she had checked her own. When it was done, she folded the bills, tucked them into a small leather pouch, and said she'd be needing supplies. She produced a list in a small, precise hand. Cornmeal, salt, beans, coffee, a new file, beeswax, good rope, lamp oil, a vial of quinine, and a box of cartridges in .44 caliber. Amos gathered it all without comment. Though the quinine told him she was 40 miles from a doctor and managing her own health in bad country, and the cartridges told him she carried a Winchester, which was a sensible gun for a woman alone in the high country. While he measured out the cornmeal, Hetty Vaughan drifted closer under the excuse of examining a shelf. Hetty was not a bad woman, but she was the town's chief channel of information, and her interest was already burning bright. "You're up at Elkhorn Bend, then, managing that whole claim alone since your husband passed." "I am. That's an awful lot of country for one person. You have family? Children?" Naomi glanced at her with eyes that were not unfriendly but were entirely unbothered. "No children. My nearest neighbor is 12 miles off. I manage well enough." "Of course you do," Hetty said quickly. "I only meant it must be lonely." "I keep occupied," Naomi said. and the subject closed like a drawer. Boyd Crane pushed off his wall and came to the counter, a deputy star pinned crooked on his coat, and a smile he used like a tool. "Ma'am." "Boyd Crane, deputy. You rode 40 miles alone." "I did," she said, not looking up from her pack. "That's a long way for a woman by herself. There's been rough men working out of the breaks north of town lately. You might think about riding with a group. Finding an escort." She finally looked at him, and her expression was polite in the way that a knife is polite before it cuts. "Thank you for the concern, Deputy Crane. I'll bear it in mind." Crane smiled and drifted back to his wall, but Amos had seen the calculation behind the man's interest, and he did not much like the shape of it. Naomi settled her saddlebags over her shoulder, picked up her hat, and looked at Amos directly. "June, then. I'll hold the prices steady," Amos said. "Quality fur doesn't move much this time of year." She nodded once, loaded her mule with the methodical ease of a woman who had done it 1,000 times, and rode north out of Coldwater without looking back. Amos stood at his counter and looked at the empty doorway a moment longer than he needed to. Old Tobias came up beside him with his tobacco finally chosen. "That is a capable woman," he said, with the frank admiration of a man of 70 who had outlived most of his opinions about what people could and couldn't do. "Yes," Amos said, "she is." He meant it more than the two plain words could carry. The town talked of little else for a week. Hetty Vaughan carried the tale of the Pelts to every doorway in Coldwater, and the tale grew in the carrying, the way tales did, until by Sunday there were folk who had it that the widow at Elkhorn Bend had killed a mountain lion with her bare hands and tanned 100 beaver in a single winter. The men who traded in fur, who knew what the work truly took, spoke of her with a grudging respect that in some of them curdled toward resentment. Because there is a kind of man who cannot bear to see a woman do better than he does the thing he has staked his pride on. Amos heard both, the respect and the resentment, and marked the men who carried the second kind, and filed their names away without quite knowing why he did it. He would learn why soon enough. The weeks after moved the way they always did in Coldwater, slow and steady, snow melt and cattle, and Sunday sermon and whiskey on Saturday. Amos restocked his shelves and sent word to his buyer in Denver about the lion skin. The reply confirmed his estimate almost to the dollar, and when he added the spring rates for the beaver and otter, the total came to considerably more than what he'd paid Naomi on the spot. That was the nature of the trade, and not dishonest. But it sat on him. She was up in 40 miles of killing country doing the trapping and the tanning and the hauling alone. And she was good enough to outwork men, twice her years. She deserved to know what the market truly bore. So Amos wrote her a letter. He addressed it to Naomi Ward, Elkhorn Bend, and sent it north with a rider. He itemized the exact prices he'd gotten, told her that when she came in June he'd adjust the payment to match, told her plainly that her work was exceptional and that she could command better prices still if she wanted to bypass local buyers and deal direct with Denver. He included his contact's name. Then he wondered, longer than was strictly necessary, whether she'd write back. He was not, as a rule, a man who watched the road for the northern rider. He found himself watching it now. Twice a week the mail came down from the high settlements, and twice a week Amos found some reason to be near the front window when it did, and told himself it was inventory that kept him there. She did write back, 3 weeks on, in that same small, precise hand. She thanked him for the accounting, said the adjustment wasn't necessary, but that she valued the honesty of a man who would send a woman the true price when he could have pocketed the difference and never been the wiser. She had considered the Denver option and thought it had merit, but preferred for now the certainty of a known buyer, which held its own worth. Then, at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, though he suspected nothing she wrote was truly an afterthought, she asked whether he stocked arrowroot, as her supply had run short, and whether he might set a jar aside. He did stock it. He set aside the largest jar he had. And then, because the letter seemed to want an answer beyond the business of it, he wrote her back that same evening. About the weather coming off the peaks, about a shipment of bad coffee he'd had to send back, about the way the town had talked of nothing but her pelts for a week. He read it over twice, decided it was too familiar, and sent it anyway. Her reply came faster that time, 10 days, and it was a little longer, and it had in it a dry line about Hetty Vaughan's questions that made him laugh out loud alone in the back room. After that, the letters went back and forth through the melt and into the green of full spring. Business on the surface of them and something else running underneath. The way the cold water ran clear on top and deep and cold beneath. She came a week earlier than planned, in the last of May, with 9 beaver this time, 2 more otter, and wrapped separate in clean burlap, 3 fox furs she had not mentioned in any letter. Amos heard the mule on the street before she appeared in his doorway, which told him he'd started, somewhere in the intervening weeks, listening for the road in a way he hadn't before. That visit they talked more. She asked about the Denver buyer, and he explained it in full. How the shipments moved, the freight cost, how the man graded quality. She listened close, asked 3 sharp, well-chosen questions, and he understood she was building a business in her head as they spoke, laying it out with the quiet thoroughness of a person who thought in systems. But she also told him a thing that turned his stomach cold. "Somebody's been at my lines," she said, evenly, folding the fox money away. 3 of my best sets on the side creek. Trap sprung and emptied, 1 stolen outright. Not an animal. An animal doesn't reset a trigger wrong on purpose to spite you. She said it without fear, only fact. "Somebody wants me off that water. You know who? I've a guess. There's a man named Vint Harlow works the country to the west of me. Him and 2 others. They came through my camp in April, uninvited, and Harlow looked at my lines in my catch the way a man looks at a thing he means to take. He said the bend was too good a stretch for a woman to be wasting." Her jaw set. I told him it wasn't being wasted. He didn't care for that. Amos knew the name. Vint Harlow was a hard case who drifted up from the southern camps. The kind of man who trapped some and stole more, who ran a couple of others meaner than smart. That's dangerous country to be alone in with a man like that eyeing your water. "All country's dangerous," Naomi said. "I don't intend to be run off ground my husband and I bled for. Samuel mapped every creek and beaver dam in that whole basin. I know it better than Harlow ever will. That's worth more than his 3 guns." She said her dead husband's name plainly, and Amos noticed she carried, tucked in her coat, a worn leather book that she touched once as she spoke of him, the way a person touches a thing without knowing they've done it. They were still talking when the afternoon crowd thinned and emptied, and at some point Amos had come around from behind the counter to sit in one of the 2 chairs by the window where folks waited on orders. Naomi sat in the other with the Denver rate sheets in her hands, and the light came through the glass at an angle that turned everything gold, and Amos Kell became aware, with a low, warm certainty, that this was the most interesting person he had been in a room with in a very long time. She looked up and caught him looking, and held his gaze a beat longer than needed before she went back to the paper. Her mouth did something small and composed that was not quite a smile, and not quite not one. "Your Denver man," she said. "Does he deal in tanned leather or only pelts?" "Leather, if the quality warrants." "Why? I've been working a technique on the deer hides from the animals I take for meat, better than the standard smoke tan. If I can do it consistent, I could add it to the supply." Amos looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Ward, do you ever sleep?" She smiled then, brief and unexpected, and it changed her whole face in a way that hit him somewhere near the sternum. "Not much. The nights are long up there." "Then come to town more often," Amos said, and immediately heard the several ways that could be taken, and felt the back of his neck go warm. Naomi tilted her head and regarded him with those green eyes. "I may do that," she said, giving nothing away, which meant she had at least chosen not to close the door on it. She stayed until near sundown, which meant taking a room at the boarding house, and Amos arranged it with the widow who ran the place personally, and was perhaps more thorough in his recommendation than was strictly necessary. Supper in Coldwater meant either the boarding house kitchen or Della's cook table on the south end of the street, where Della served 4 tables out of her front room and made the best elk stew in 3 valleys. Amos found himself walking to Della's that evening in his good shirt, which he had changed into for no reason he cared to name. Naomi was already there at one of the tables, reading a small worn book, the same leather book from her coat. She looked up when he came in, surprise crossing her face before it settled back to composed. "Misty, Kell, Mrs. Ward, mind if I join you? Della's only got the 4 tables and 2 are taken." This was factual. It was also not the whole reason he was there. He thought she probably knew both things. "Please," she said, and moved the book into her coat pocket. They ate stew and cornbread and drank coffee strong enough to do damage, and they talked, not about fur prices, though those had their place, but about the high country. She described a bend in the Coldwater where the cottonwoods made a green ceiling in summer and the beaver worked the dam at dusk, and the way the quiet up there was a different thing than loneliness. Amos told her about coming west at 22 with $300 and a stubborn idea, about building the post board by board. He was not a man who talked about himself, and he found to his surprise that he was doing exactly that, and that she listened with her whole attention in a way that made him want to keep on. "Your husband," he said carefully, when there was a pause. "How long were you up at the bend before he passed?" 3 years. We came out from Ohio in 75. Samuel believed in the land very much. She was quiet, looking at her cup. He was never suited to the wet and the cold, though he'd never admit it. The fever took hold in October and never let go. By November, he was gone. She touched the book in her pocket. Once, this was his. A field book. He wrote down everything, every creek, every dam, every animal and season, the whole country mapped out in his own hand, with drawings. He was a careful man that way. When he died, I couldn't read it for months. Now I read it most nights. It's how I keep the lines. It's how I keep him, son. She looked up, and there was no self-pity in it. I don't tell you that for sympathy. I tell you because I think you're a man who prefers the full picture. I am, Amos said, and I thank you for it. He turned his coffee cup slow between his hands. I lost someone too, a long way back. Not a wife, a brother. We came west together, the 2 of us. That was the stubborn idea I mentioned, both of us in it. He drowned crossing a river in flood the 2nd spring, trying to save a horse that wasn't worth saving. I built the post alone after that, and I think for a long while I built it so I wouldn't have to sit still long enough to feel how alone was. A man can hide in work. I expect you know that. I know it exactly, Naomi said, and something in her face opened a little further. It's the only mercy some seasons have in them. The work doesn't ask you how you feel. It only asks you to do it, and you can. And that's enough to get you to the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that, she agreed, and they sat a moment in the understanding of it, 2 people who had each buried someone and gone on, because going on was the only thing grief left a body to do. "You've been alone a long while too," she said. "Not a question. I have. By a different road than yours. But yes." She nodded slowly, as though confirming something she'd suspected, and the talk moved on to lighter ground. She told him a story about a beaver that had outwitted her best sets for a whole season until she'd finally outthought it, and he told her about the time he'd sold a bishop a mule that turned out to be blind in one eye, and a letter of complaint that had followed. which she said was the funniest thing she'd heard in a year, and did not laugh so much as let it show in her eyes, which he was learning was how she laughed at the things that reached her deepest. But under the lightness, something had settled between them that had not been there before. Some acknowledgement of shared ground that had nothing to do with the river. Walking back to the post that night, he still slept in the back room. A habit he'd never moved past even when he could have built a proper house. Amos stood a long time on the porch and looked at the stars over the mountains and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight so long he'd forgotten how it felt to breathe without it. But the country did not leave them to their letters and their golden afternoons for long. In the second week of June, Naomi came in hard and early, her mule lathered, her face set like flint. She laid it out plain before she'd even set down her load. Vint Harlow had made his move. He and his 2 men had come to Elkhorn Bend 3 days back, in the open this time, and told her the water was theirs now, that a widow had no legal hold on a trapline and no way to defend one, and that she could clear out on her own legs or be cleared out. Harlow had stood in her own camp and told her she had a week to be gone. I said no, Naomi said. I said the claims filed legal and the lines are mine and I'd hold them. Harlow laughed and said there was no law 40 miles up the cold water but the law of who was willing. Her hands were steady but her voice had gone very quiet, which Amos was learning was the sound of her at her most dangerous. Then he had one of his men cut my mule loose and put a ball through my smokehouse roof, just to show me the shape of it. And they rode off. But they'll be back inside the week. Amos was already reaching for his coat. We'll go to Crane. That's the law's business. They went to the deputy, and Boyd Crane listened and hitched his belt and was as useless as Amos had feared. 40 miles was a long ride, Crane said. Harlow hadn't actually harmed her person. It was her word against his on the trap cutting. The marshal was 3 counties over and wouldn't stir for a fur dispute in the high country. And besides, and here Crane looked at Naomi with that tool of a smile, this was exactly the trouble a woman got into trying to work country meant for men. And hadn't he said as much in the spring, and wouldn't she be better off settling near town where a body could keep her safe? Naomi looked at him, a long moment. I didn't come here to be told the trouble is mine for existing, she said. I came to report 3 men threatening to take a legal claim by force. If the law won't ride, the law won't ride. But you'll not sit there and make it my fault. And she walked out, and Amos followed, and behind them Crane went back to his biscuit, having done nothing and expecting no consequence for it. Out on the street, Amos stopped her. Then, I'll ride up with you. She turned on him, and for the first time something in her steadiness cracked. Not into fear, but into a fierce warning. I didn't tell you this so you'd feel you had to come save me, Amos Kell. I've been managing that country alone since November. I don't need a man to stand in front of me. I know you don't, Amos said. I've watched you. You're more capable in that country than any man I've traded with, myself included. I'm not asking to stand in front of you. He held her eyes. I'm asking to stand beside you. There's a difference, and I think you know it. 3 guns is 3 guns, Naomi. You'd do the same for me, and you know that too. Let me come. Not because you can't, because no one should have to face down 3 men alone when there's someone willing to make it 2 against 3. She studied him with that particular high accuracy she had, and whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find it. Beside, she said. Not in front. Beside, then all right. They rode north the next morning, and the country climbed and roughened as they went. The lower meadows giving way to timber, and then to the high canyon where the cold water came down green and cold, and the cottonwoods stood thick along the banks. It was, Amos had to admit, the finest trapping country he had seen in years, and he understood why Harlow wanted it, and why Naomi would not give it up. She showed him the lines as they rode, reading the land out of Samuel's field book, the creeks and dams her husband had mapped, and Amos saw that she knew every foot of it, that the dead man's careful hand and her own hard years had made her the truest master of that basin there was. And on the way, she told him the rest of the mountain lion. He had wondered about that skin, the flawless one, and he asked how she'd taken it, and her face went still, and she was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she did. "Last October," she said, "right before the fever took Samuel for good. There was a lion come down off the high rocks, big old male, past his best years, and gone mean with it the way old cats do when they can't take the swift game anymore. He started on our traps, robbing the sets, and then he took a calf, and then he took to circling the camp at night so the mule wouldn't settle. Samuel went out after it. He was sick already, though we'd neither of us say the word out loud, weak in a way that scared me. But he was a proud man, and it was his stock and his camp, and he went." Her voice stayed level, which Amos had learned was how she carried the heaviest things. It came at him out of the willows along the creek, put him down before he could bring the rifle up, and had him by the shoulder, and would have had his throat in another second. I was 40 yards off with the wash. I had one shot in me, and the willows in the way, and no time to think about any of it. I took it. I hit the cat, but not clean, only enough to turn it, and it came off Samuel and came at me instead. She pushed up her sleeve as she rode, and there along her forearm was the scar, thick and ropey, wrist to elbow, white against her weathered skin. I was out of the shot, and it was 300 pounds and closing, and I had nothing but the skinning knife on my belt and Samuel's rifle fallen empty in the mud between us. I don't remember all of it. In order. I remember the weight of it when it hit me, like a horse falling on you. I remember the smell. I remember getting the knife in and the knife in and the knife in, and thinking, very clear, very calm, that I would not die in that creek and leave Samuel down and bleeding and sick and alone. That thought did most of the work my arms couldn't. She pulled the sleeve back down. When it was over, I had it dead, and my arm laid open to the bone, and Samuel torn at the shoulder, and the two of us crawled back to the fire and stitched each other by lamplight with hands that shook, his from fever and mine from the cold that comes after. 3 weeks later, the fever finished what it had started, and he was gone anyway, and I was alone with a half-healed arm and a dead husband and a lion skin drying on the rack. She looked ahead at the trail. I tanned that skin over the whole of the winter, slow, one-handed at first, because I would not let the worst night of my life be for nothing. It's the best work I've ever done, and I sold it to you across a counter, and you weighed it and named a fair price, and never knew you were holding it." She glanced at him. "So when Vint Harlow tells me a widow can't hold hard country, I must understand, I have already held harder than anything he can bring me. The worst the world had, it brought to that creek in October. Everything since has been easier than that." Amos looked at the scar, and at her, and said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing to say that would not be smaller than what she'd told him. Then he said, "I'm glad you didn't die in that creek." It was plain, and it was true, and she looked at him and nodded once, and something passed between them heavier and warmer than anything the golden afternoons had held. They reached Elkhorn Bend by dusk. The cabin was small and sound, the smokehouse with a fresh hole in its roof, the whole place kept with the same precise care as her tanning. They laid their plans careful. Harlow would come in the open, expecting a lone widow, expecting fear. He would not expect 2 guns, and he would not expect people who knew the ground had chosen it in advance. That first night, waiting, she showed him a page of the field book, turned it toward him across the firelight, and it was a thing she had never done for anyone, he understood. Let another's eyes on her dead husband's hand. There were maps in it, and drawings of tracks and dams, and in the margins small dry observations in Samuel's writing that made her mouth twitch toward a smile as she read them aloud. He had a humor to him, she said. You wouldn't have known it to look at him. It's all in here, where every good set is, where the high ground sits over every trail. It's how I'll know where to put us when Harlow comes. She closed the book gentle. And it's how he's not gone all the way. I read it, and he's still teaching me the country. Does that sound foolish? No, Amos said. It sounds like the truest thing I've heard. A person's not gone while someone still carries what they knew. She looked at him a long moment across the fire and did not answer, but she did not need to. Harlow came on the third morning, the way men like him always came, slow and easy and sure, 3 riders down the canyon trail with the ease of men who did not expect to fail. Naomi and Amos were not in the cabin where he looked for them. They were set in the rocks above the trail. High ground Samuel's field book had marked as the place a body could see the whole approach, and they had the light behind them and Harlow's men squinting up into it. Vint Harlow, Naomi called down, and her voice carried clear and cold across the canyon. This claim is filed legal in Coldwater. These lines are mine. You've cut my traps and shot my smokehouse and threatened my life, and there are more ways than a marshal for a thing like that to catch up to a man. You can turn around now and work your own water, or you can push it and learn what 40 miles of country teaches a person about defending what's theirs. Harlow's smile was ugly even at that distance. That your storekeeper up there, widow? Brought a shopman to fight your battles? No, Amos called down and levered around into the chamber loud enough to carry. I brought myself, and she brought herself, and she's the one put a mountain lion in the ground with a skinning knife so I'd think hard about how much you want this water. He let that sit. There's 2 of us in high rocks, with the sun at our backs and the whole approach sighted, and you're 3 men in the open who came expecting a scared woman. That's not the fight you rode up here for, Harlow. Ride out. For a long moment nobody moved, and the canyon held its breath the way the trading post had held its breath the morning Naomi walked in. Then one of Harlow's men, the smarter of the 2, muttered something and reined his horse back. And the second followed. And Vint Harlow sat alone a moment on the trail with his ugly smile curdling, doing the arithmetic that even a hard man does when the odds have turned and the ground is wrong, and finding it did not come out his way. This isn't finished, Harlow said. It is if you ride now, Naomi answered. It's the only way it finishes with you still able to ride at all. And Vint Harlow, who had counted on a widow alone and found instead 2 people on high ground who had already faced worse than him and lived, turned his horse and rode out of the canyon. But Amos watched the set of the man's shoulders as he went, and did not like it, and said so. A man like that doesn't quit because the odds turned once. He quits when it costs him more than pride. We haven't cost him that yet. He was right. Harlow came back that night. They had known enough not to sleep easy. They kept the fire low and the cabin dark and took the watch's turn and turn about, and it was Naomi on watch in the black hour before dawn when she heard it. Not hooves, for the men had left their horses back and come in on foot, but the small wrong sound of a boot finding a dry branch where no boot should be. She woke Amos with a hand over his mouth and 1 word breathed against his ear, and they were up and armed and out the back low window into the cold before Harlow's men reached the cabin. There were the 3 of them, and they had come to burn her out. Amos smelled the coal oil one of them carried before he saw the men at all. And they had come expecting to find 2 people asleep in a cabin they meant to set a light around them. They did not find that. They found the cabin empty and dark, and then they found that the country itself had turned against them, because Naomi Ward knew every stone and shadow of that ground, and they knew none of it, and she had set herself and Amos in the dark where Samuel's book had taught her the whole yard could be watched. Vint Harlow, she called from the dark, and the man with the oil can froze. You came to burn a sleeping woman in her bed. Set it down. Harlow did not set it down. Harlow, being the kind of man he was, threw it and went for his gun, and the night came apart into muzzle flash and shouting. Amos took the man on the left, who had drawn on the sound of Naomi's voice, and put him down with a shot through the shoulder that spun him into the woodpile. The third man fired wild into the dark toward Amos, and the bull took Amos high in the side and turned him half around, and he went down against the cabin wall with the cold shock of it stealing his breath. And Vint Harlow, seeing one of the two threats fall, came on toward the muzzle flash that had been Naomi, his own gun up. Sure now, close. He had forgotten, if he had ever truly believed it, what she was. Naomi Ward, who had put 300 pounds of mountain lion in the ground with a skinning knife and her husband's empty rifle, did not miss. She fired once, and Vint Harlow stopped as though he had walked into a wall, and sat down slowly in the dirt of the yard he had come to take, and did not get up. The third man, hearing his leader fall, dropped his gun into the dark and put his hands where they could be seen, and began, very fast, to explain that he was only hired, only along, wanted no part of it. Then it was quiet, and there was the smell of powder and coal oil, and Naomi was across the yard and on her knees beside Amos, with her hands pressed to the wound in his side. "You're not allowed to die," she said, low and fierce. "On ground you came to help me hold. Do you hear me, Amos Kell? That is not the arrangement." And Amos, through the cold and the pain, found the breath to say that he had no intention of it, and meant it, because a man does not go looking to leave the world the same year he has finally found the person he wants to stay in it for. The bull had gone through clean and missed the worst of what it could have hit. Naomi packed it and bound it with the same sure hands that tanned the flawless Pelts, and got him inside and warm. And at first light, she tied the surviving man to his own saddle and loaded the two who could not ride, and drove the whole grim caravan the 40 miles down to Coldwater herself, with Amos white and swaying but upright beside her, because she would not leave him, and would not leave the reckoning undone. Boyd Crane, faced with a wounded storekeeper, a dead claim jumper, and a bound confessing accomplice laid out in the street in front of the whole town, discovered that the law could stir itself, after all, when a thing was made plain enough. The surviving man talked, and what he said put an end to Vint Harlow's reputation and his crew both, and cleared Naomi and Amos clean, self-defense, in the plain sight of a witness and a burned smell of coal oil that told its own story. It was not a thing anyone celebrated. A man was dead, and Amos carried a scar in his side the rest of his days to match the one on Naomi's arm. But the lines stayed hers, and the country up the Coldwater grew quiet again, and no man tried Naomi Ward's water after that, because the story of what happened to the last one who did traveled the high camps faster than any letter. Amos mended slow through that summer, and Naomi tended him with a brusque tenderness that fooled neither of them about what lay under it. And somewhere in the long convalescence, in the small daily acts of a person keeping another person alive and comfortable, the thing between them stopped being a question either of them needed to ask. Through the summer and into the fall she came to Coldwater more often, and Amos rode up to the bend when the post could spare him, and the thing between them grew the way the truest things do, slow and sure, and without either of them forcing it. The first hard snow of that autumn brought the second time Amos Kell was made to understand exactly what kind of woman he had come to love. Naomi had gone up to the bend in late October to pull her fall sets before the freeze locked the country down. And she was due back in Coldwater on the 6th day, and on the 6th day a storm came down off the peaks a full month early, white and screaming. The kind of storm that buried the trail and killed men who thought they knew better. She did not come on the 6th day, nor the 7th, and Amos Kell, who had sworn to himself he would never be the man who told her the country was too dangerous, who respected her competence past any need to hover over it, found on the 8th morning that respect and terror could live in the same chest at the same time. And he saddled his horse and rode north into the tail of the storm, because he could not do otherwise. He met her 12 miles out. She was coming down the buried trail on foot, leading a mule gone lame. Snow to her thighs, her face wind-scoured and gray with cold, but her eyes clear and her stride unbroken. And slung across the mule was her full catch, not one pelt of it abandoned. She had gone through the ice at a creek crossing on the 5th day, she told him later, by the fire at Della's with her hands wrapped around a cup she could not yet feel, and had hauled herself out and built a fire with hands that would not work and dried herself before the cold could take her, and then, because the mule had gone lame and the trail was gone, had simply started walking, and kept walking, because walking was the only thing that would get her home, and so walking was what there was to do. You could have died up there, Amos said, and heard the fear come through in it, and did not try to hide it. I could have, she agreed, matter of fact. I didn't. She looked at him over the fire, and her scoured face softened. You rode into that storm after me. I did. You know I didn't need saving. I know it, Amos said. I didn't ride out to save you. I knew you'd save yourself. You always have. I rode out because the thought of you cold and alone up there and me warm and safe down here was a thing I could not sit still inside of. That's not the same as thinking you can't manage. It's just that I'd rather be cold beside you than warm without you. I expect I'd better tell you that plainly, since it seems to be the truth of the matter. Naomi Ward looked at him for a long moment over the fire, and the last of the ice went out of her, though not from the warmth of the flames. That, she said quietly, is the right answer, Amos Kell. That is exactly the right answer. And she reached across and put her thawing hand over his, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and nothing more needed saying. Boyd Crane made one more attempt at interference, cornering Amos in the post to observe that a frontier woman like that wasn't the settling kind, and a storekeeper wasn't what she was used to. And Amos looked at him level and said that he happened to like Naomi Ward exactly as she was, open country and all. And was there something Crane meant to buy? Crane bought a box of matches and left, and after that he let it lie. He was not a bad man, only an entitled one, and he had the basic decency to recognize, once it was settled, that Naomi Ward had made her choice, and it was not his business. Hetty Vaughan's verdict, when it came, was warmer. I think it's just fine, she announced to the boarding-house widow in a voice pitched to Carrie while Amos was in the back. She's a capable woman, and he's a good man, and it's high time for the both of them. Amos chose to take it as a blessing. November came, and with it the anniversary of Samuel Ward's death, and Amos left space in his letters for what it might mean without pressing on it. Naomi wrote back honest, as she was about everything. She had sat with it a day, she said, had thought of Samuel with respect and tenderness, and had then gone back to work, which was what Samuel himself had always said was the right way through most things. She did not feel guilty for what had grown between herself and Amos. Love was not a thing that ran out when you spent it in more than one direction over a life, she wrote. Samuel had known her well and would have understood what she needed, and been glad she'd found it. Amos read that letter in the back room of the post on a cold night, and sat with it a long time, and felt something settle in him all the way down. In December, on her last visit before the winter roads closed, Amos asked Naomi Ward to marry him. He had thought hard about how, and decided that ceremony mattered less than honesty, so he did not wait for a perfect moment. He asked her in the post with the little stove going warm and orange against the cold, after they'd closed the ledger on the year and the numbers had told a good story. He came around the counter and stood before her. I want to build something with you, he said. Not because you need what I have, or because you can't manage without me. You've made it plain you can, and I admire it entire, but because I believe what we'd build together would be larger than what either of us builds alone. And because I'd like to wake with you in my life every morning I've got left. I'd like you to have the choosing of whether you want the same. Naomi looked at him a long, still moment, her hands folded on the counter, her green eyes hiding nothing. "I want the same thing," she said, "with the understanding that I keep my lines. Elkhorn Bend is mine, and the trapping is mine, and I'll go up to the cold water in season for as long as I'm able." "I'd not have it any other way," Amos said, and meant it entirely. "And I'm choosing this because it's what I want," she said. "Not because the town expects it or because it's easier. Because I love you. And you're the person I want to build with." "Clear," Amos said, with his heart in his throat. "Then, yes." And she stepped forward and put her hands on his chest, and Amos Kell kissed her forehead and her cheek and then her mouth, and held her with the careful certainty of a man who understands he is holding something precious and is not afraid of the weight of it. They married in January of 1879 in the small church at Coldwater, with near the whole town turned out. Because when Amos Kell finally did a personal thing, the town had a great deal of interest in seeing it. Della made a cake with real sugar frosting, which was a considerable expense and stood for the town's official approval. Old Tobias Fenn cried quietly through the vows and blamed it on dust in his eye, and no one believed him. Naomi did not sell the Bend. She kept the trapping rights and leased the land to a neighboring family who needed the acreage, a sensible arrangement that made steady income while keeping her options open. She moved into the space above the trading post, which Amos had spent the winter turning from a storeroom into a proper home with a bedroom and a sitting room and a kitchen that caught the morning light. And he had written to ask her about every part of it. Because it would be her home as much as his, and he wanted her to walk in and feel that. When she saw it the first time, standing in the doorway with her hat in her hands and the light doing its work on the wood floors, she was quiet a moment. And then she said, "Amos," and the way she said his name held everything. Every letter, every golden afternoon, the ride up to the Bend. The way he had told her the true price of every fur before she asked. It was the most complete thing he had ever heard. They worked well together, which he had been fairly sure of, and which proved itself at once. She had a business mind sharper than his own, and within a month she had found 3 items he overstocked and 2 he ran short on, and laid the analysis out on the kitchen table with the same precise honesty she brought to everything, and Amos looked at the numbers and then at her, and said, "You're right," and changed his next order. She had opinions, too, about the way he priced for the ranchers versus the trappers, and about extending a season's credit to the families the drought had hit hardest, which she argued not from softness but from arithmetic. A family kept solvent was a customer for 20 years, where a family broken was a debt written off and a store the town learned to resent. Amos listened, and did it her way, and the ledger proved her right inside a year. He had built the post alone for 9 years by his own lights, and had thought himself good at it, and he was, and she made it better, and there was no wound in that for him. Only the plain pleasure of a thing he loved being improved by a mind he admired. The Denver leather trade grew through the spring, the buyer sent a contract on better terms than Amos had expected, and Naomi signed it at the kitchen table with Samuel's field book open beside her, because she had been reading it again, and it had given her a notion about a new process for the summer hides that she wanted to test before she committed to it. She was, Amos thought, watching her read and sign and think all at once, the most alive person he had ever known. And every month, in season, Naomi rode up the Coldwater to walk her lines and refresh her traps, and Amos learned to read her leaving and her return the way he read the weather, with respect for what he could not control and attention to the signs of safe passage. He did not ask her not to go. It was her work, and she was better at it than anyone, and she carried a Winchester she could use with a precision that even Boyd Crane had once admitted was a thing to see. Crane himself, over that first winter, arrived at a peace with the whole business that Amos judged genuine rather than performed, and by spring was cordial to them both in the unremarkable way of a man who has moved on, which was all Amos needed of him. In the summer of 1879, on an evening in the kitchen while the sun went down gold over the mountains, Naomi told him she was expecting a child. She said it plain, her eyes on his face, reading him with her particular accuracy. And what she read was a man handed something too large for words, whose careful control had come undone, whose eyes had gone bright, and whose hands had reached for hers with a wonder she felt in her own chest like something opening. "You're happy," she said. Not a question, but a recognition. "I am." Amos started, and his voice caught in a way it never did, and he cleared it and tried again and still could not finish it, because the feeling was larger than the words there were, and he pulled her into his arms instead, and she laughed against his shoulder and held him back, and the gold light came through the window, and the river ran its steady course, and Amos Kell felt the future arrive. Their son was born in the spring of 1880 in the room above the post, red-faced and squinting and furious at the whole proceeding, and they named him Samuel. Samuel, for the man who had believed in the land and mapped every creek of it in a careful hand, because that name deserved to be carried forward with respect. It was Naomi's idea, and when she said it, Amos looked at her with a full heart and told her it was exactly right. Which it was. Love was not a finite thing. She had told him so in a letter once, on the anniversary of a grief, and the naming of the boy was the proof of it standing up and breathing. The dead man honored in the living child, and the living child no smaller for it, and Amos Kell no smaller for loving a woman who had loved before him. There was room in it. That was the whole secret of the thing, he came to understand. A true life had room in it for the living and the dead both, and lost nothing by the room. Old Tobias Fenn came to the post to see the baby, looked at him in Amos's arms with the serious consideration of a man reviewing an important document, and said, "Good eyes. He'll do." Which was Tobias's whole benediction. Hetty Vaughan arrived with a knitted blanket she'd plainly been at for 2 months, which meant she had known of the child before it was announced, which no one addressed. The years that followed had the quality of a thing built careful and lived in with joy. The post grew, and the leather business grew with it, and between the two trades and the trapping lines and the Denver connection, they were not merely comfortable but genuinely prosperous. A second son came, dark-haired and loud and opinionated from the first hour, and they raised the two of them in a place where the land was real, and the work was real, and the love in the house was the realest thing of all. And on the long winter evenings, when the boys were small, Naomi would take down Samuel's field book from the shelf where it lived now beside the folded lion skin. And she would read to her son, the boy named for the man who wrote it, the maps and the drawings and the small dry observations in the careful hand, teaching him the creeks and the seasons and the ways of the beaver and the otter, so that the knowledge of the man who had died in the high country lived on in the boy who bore his name. Amos would sit across the room with the second boy asleep against him, and listen to his wife read another man's words to their child, and feel no jealousy in it at all, only the largeness of it, the way a life could hold everything if you let it, and lost nothing by the holding. And when young Samuel was old enough, Naomi took him up to Elkhorn Bend and walked him along the lines with the book in his own hands, and showed him the creek where the willows grew, and did not tell him, not then, what had happened there in an October before he was born, only taught him to read the water and the sign the way his namesake had, and the dead man's country passed into the living boy's keeping, and nothing was lost that anyone had loved. Amos Kell would stand sometimes in the doorway and watch his wife read to his son from another man's book, and feel the accumulated weight of everything present in the room and carried forward real. The Pelts on the counter that first cold morning. The silence of a whole town recalibrating. The letters, the golden afternoons. The ride up the cold water, the worst night in a creek, turned into the best work of a pair of hands. The storm she had walked out of. The yard she had held. He had married a woman the whole town underestimated the morning she walked in with a bundle of pelts, and had learned, as the town had learned, that she was the most capable and most alive person any of them would ever know. She had held the hardest country alone, and lost the man she loved and gone on, and had chosen, out of strength and not need, to build a second life beside a man who saw her true. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was more than most were ever given. In the summer of 1879, on an evening in the kitchen while the sun went down gold over the mountains, Naomi told him she was expecting a child. She said it plain, her eyes on his face, reading him with her particular accuracy. And what she read was a man handed something too large for words, whose careful control had come undone, whose eyes had gone bright and whose hands had reached for hers with a wonder she felt in her own chest like something opening. Their son was born in the spring of 1880 in the room above the post, and they named him Samuel. Samuel, for the man who had believed in the land and mapped every creek of it in a careful hand, because that name deserved to be carried forward with respect. It was Naomi's idea, and when she said it, Amos looked at her with a full heart and told her it was exactly right, which it was. Love was not a finite thing. She had told him so in a letter once, and the naming of the boy was the proof of it. The dead man honored in the living child, no smaller for the love that had come after. The years that followed had the quality of a thing built careful and lived in with joy. The post grew, and the leather business grew with it. Naomi kept her lines. A second son came, dark-haired and loud, and they raised the two of them in a place where the land was real and the work was real. And on the long winter evenings, when the boys were small, Naomi would take down Samuel's field book from the shelf where it lived now, beside the folded lion skin, and she would read to her son, the boy named for the man who wrote it, the maps and the drawings and the small dry observations in the careful hand, teaching him the creeks and the seasons and the ways of the beaver and the otter, so that the knowledge of the man who had died in the high country lived on in the boy who bore his name. And when young Samuel was old enough, she took him up to Elkhorn Bend and walked him along the lines with the book in his own hands, and the dead man's country passed into the living boy's keeping, and nothing was lost that anyone had loved. Amos Kell would stand sometimes in the doorway and watch his wife read to his son from another man's book, and feel no jealousy in it at all. Only the largeness of a life that had room in it for the living and the dead both, that honored what had come before without being smaller for it. He had married a woman the whole town had underestimated the morning she walked in with a bundle of pelts, and had learned, as the town had learned, that she was the most capable and most alive person any of them had known. She had held the hardest country alone and lost the man she loved and gone on, and had chosen, out of strength and not need, to build a second life beside a man who saw her true. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. And it was more than most were ever given. The trading post stood solid on the main street of Coldwater for many years, with two names on the sign above the door. People came and went through it in every season, and the counter where the Pelts had landed that cold spring morning held 10,000 transactions after. Flour and rope and powder and cloth and all the materials of lives being built and kept. Amos worked it with the same quiet competence he always had. Naomi worked beside him and beyond him, her leather known in Denver and further east, her trapping lines along the Coldwater still walked in season because the river was hers and she loved it. Young Samuel Kell grew up and studied the natural sciences the way his namesake would have wanted, and his brother stayed close and took on the trade, and the field book passed down among them, added to now in more than one hand, the dead man's careful notes carried forward by the living. And in the evenings, long into the years that came, when the sky over the mountains went deep and the stars came out enormous and cold and beautiful, Amos Kell and Naomi Ward Kell would sit on the porch they had built above the post and let the quiet come in around them, the comfortable, inhabited quiet of two people who know each other entirely and have found in that knowing not a diminishment but an expansion of everything. The river ran its patient course out of the high country, as it always had. The cottonwoods whispered, and it was good, and it was real, and it endured.